and all is still go as we monitor our status for it. Good luck and Godspeed.
Have you ever had a premonition, a feeling that something dreadful was about to happen?
No, Mother, I have not been drinking.
Do you happen to have a pair of birds that are just friendly?
We all go a little mad sometimes.
I have to go back into the past once more, just once more.
This is HitchPod Season 2, Episode 1, a podcast counting down the 20 best movies of the wonderful 20th century director Alfred Hitchcock. In this podcast, we rewatch a Hitchcock movie every month or so and then talk about it. I'm Dan Lipke and I'm recording from inside a sack of potatoes.
And I'm Kat Jones and I'm checking into this podcast under the name Oscar Wilde because this time around we're rewatching the 20th best Hitchcock movie as voted on by our listeners. And this is Frenzy from 1972.
Yes, 1972. What was happening in 1972, Kat?
Well, we thought we'd do a bit of a recap in this second season and we're going to have a bit of a think about, because not everyone was born in 1972. I know you were born.
Just scraped in, yep. 1 year old at the time.
Yeah, but this is early 70s. Here's some of the key features of 1972. Apparently, several burglars were arrested during a break-in of the Democratic National Committee office at the Watergate Hotel.
I'm sure nothing came of that.
Nothing came of that.
I've also got the arcade game Pong was released, so that must have been great. So imagine the thrill of hitting a digital dot that would bounce back and forth between two sticks, basically. Very exciting.
Incredible. What an exciting game. We also had the Mary Tyler Moore Show was one of the most popular shows. And apparently they had a very special episode on the topic of wage disparity between men and women, solving the problem forever, I understand.
No more problem there.
No more problems.
We also had the book Jonathan Livingston's Seagull, which was improbably very successful, a book about a seagull.
And a magazine, Ms., was first published by Gloria Steinem. And this magazine came with the tagline that it won't tell you how to make jelly, but how to seize control of your life.
High goals there from the magazine.
Yeah.
We also had Clint Eastwood. He was asking punks if they felt lucky. And Liza Minnelli was declaring that life was a cabaret.
Yep. And on more scientific grounds out of the entertainment world, the MRI was invented in this year.
Very clever.
Yeah.
We also had the most popular names for babies, at least in the US, were Jennifer and Michael.
That sounds
I've
about right.
known a few Jennifers and Michaels in my time.
Yep. Hello to all the Jennifers and Michaels who are listening, who were born in 1972. We had screening of passengers and luggage becoming mandatory on all flights in this year.
Presumably before then you just wandered onto a plane whenever you wanted with whatever you felt like.
There were a lot of hijacks in that era, weren't there?
Yep.
We had the Olympics too, right?
Speaking of things which had terrorist attacks at them, the Munich Olympics, and we had, perhaps on a happier note, we had Mark Spitz. He won 7 gold medals in the swimming there.
In other sporting news, in 1972, was this a big tournament, this World Chess Championship title?
This was Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky. They played off for the World Chess Championship title. This was very US-Russia dominated, so Bobby Fischer won that, so he became the champion.
Symbolic of the Cold War here. Hitchcock could have done a movie about that.
Probably, yeah. I'd love to see a Hitchcock chess movie.
Yeah. What about songs?
Probably the main song was Don McLean. He released a theme song for the movie American Pie, which came out 27 years later.
Yep.
And of course, 1972 also saw the release of Frenzy, which I think is, like, as we record this, about a month over exactly 50 years old.
Wow, and it does, it is a bit dated, but we will take the strengths and weaknesses of that in our discussion of it today. Of course, Frenzy voted the 20th best movie when we did a poll of all of our listeners and patrons and so on. So there are 19 more movies to come after this that are more popular.
Yes.
And presumably, how many? 32 movies less popular than Frenzy.
Yes, indeed. Yep. So I think it's your turn to give us the recap for this one.
Yes. In the first season, Dan would do the recap. In this season, I'm going to do the recap, and I'm going to recap it and sum it up a little bit swifter than we used to. So if you'd like a longer recap, you can go and listen to our earlier podcast on Frenzy.
Yeah,
and that is available in the feed.
Yes, currently available in the feed.
Yep. And so that was the first time around. Feel free to go back. But here is a reminder of the movie if you haven't rewatched it yet. Now, London London, when we enter into this movie, it's being terrorised by the dreadful necktie killer. He or she strangles women with his necktie and then leaves it around their neck as a gruesome but occasionally stylish calling card.
Yep.
Our lead character, and inevitably the man will be wrongfully accused of being the necktie killer. That is Richard Blaney. The actor is John Finch, and he's a rather dim and angry man who quits his job at the pub because he's caught drinking on the job at about 9:30 in the morning.
Yes, and the guy who played the pub owner there was Bernard Cribbins. He played Forsyth, and he, as we record this, he died literally 24 hours ago. So,
oh my God,
age 93. Yes.
Oh, the jolly old age.
He was also in Doctor Who, and he was a Womble. So,
oh my God, was he a Womble in Doctor Who?
I think so.
Yeah, great. He was a Womble. That is a very funny feature of funny stat for our podcast here. Anyway, Richard, the very sort of anti-hero of this movie, he argues with his ex-wife Brenda. She's played by Barbara Lee Hunt, who runs a successful matchmaking business. The next day, though, she's found murdered. So, of course, he's the main suspect, which is a bit of a shame because he's not the murderer. The murderer is his rather unpleasant, sleazy friend whose name is Rusk, again, improbably named. Barry Foster is the actor. Now, Rusk, we saw rape and murder poor old Brenda. Mm-hmm. Anyway, Richard goes on the run. He knows he's a suspect, and he goes on the run with his girlfriend Babs, who he worked at the pub with. Her, the actor there is Anna Massey, and they hide out with an old Air Force buddy and his rather unhappy, unpleasant
wife. I think this is his wife.
Wife, right? Yep. Anyway, the next day after that happens, Babs quits her job, and then she's promptly murdered by Rusk as well. So everyone that Richard knew at this point has been murdered, and Rusk throws her body in the back of a potato truck, as you do, before realising that she tore off the tie pin as she was strangled. So the tie pin is missing. He has to climb in the back of the truck, and then that drives off with him in it. Scrambling through the potato sacks looking for the tie pin, which he finds. Anyway, about now we check in with Chief Inspector Oxford, who's a great character. He's played by Alec McCowan, and he's in charge of trying to track down the necktie killer. And his wife is peripheral to this, but she keeps feeding him awful home-cooked cuisine as they chat through the various motives and suspects and theories about the killer. Anyway, Rusk escapes from the potato truck eventually, and he heads back home, catches up with Richard, who's hiding him on the run, begs him for help, but no, Richard is framed by Rusk and tried and convicted with impressive judicial swiftness. This happens. Hitchcock always had these trials just over and done with in a flash. No mucking around with all this silly busy work and the boring parts of it. Anyway, fortunately, he then escapes from a prison hospital with relative ease, and he heads off to confront Rusk, and he finds another dead body in Rusk's apartment. So when Oxford shows up, it looks like Richard's just going to be accused again. But instead, Oxford's already cracked the case, and he waits there for Rusk to return and arrests him instead.
Yes.
Happy ending.
Yes, well, happy-ish for the ones who survived anyway, the ones who weren't murdered by the killer. Do you have blood all over your shower curtains? Crop dust in your best suit? Bird poo on your jungle gym? Then you need Hayes Laundering Services. Hayes, cleaning up filth since 1934. So I've got 3 jokes and a limerick inspired by this movie. So this is going to be a semi-regular segment that we've got here. So I've written 3 jokes and a limerick, and you just tell me thumbs up or thumbs down.
Okay.
You could thumbs down all of them if you like.
You've got to see if you can get 4 out of 4.
Well, I don't think I'm getting 4 out of 4, but we'll see.
Okay.
Okay, joke 1. Did you know there was a deleted scene from Frenzy? It came after Richard used the alias Oscar Wilde to check into the hotel, and the hotel owners asked him to prove his identity with a classic witty aphorism. But it was eventually cut because Hitch decided that it was just too obvious for Richard to say, "There is only one thing in the world worse than being recognised as the necktie killer, and that is not being recognised as the necktie killer."
I think that's thumbs up on that one. That's pretty good.
Okay.
I think that's good. That's pretty good.
Next one. I'm hearing Bob Rusk had an extra 3 years added to his prison sentence. Turns out he was found guilty of not just rape and murder, but also the crime of using a grocer's truck to cheat in an impromptu potato sack race. Thumbs down.
Thumbs down.
Yep.
I like the start of that one, though. It had a promising start, but the punchline didn't quite make it. Thumbs up, thumbs down.
Thumbs down. All right, third joke. Lots of people are saying the Londoners of that era roaming around the streets were callous to ignore Bab's screams as she was being brutally murdered. But that's before you realise they probably thought it was just another one of those bloody Beatles rooftop concerts.
Yeah, I think you get a thumbs up for that one.
Okay.
I think that's okay.
All right.
Particularly, that joke would have landed well in the Times.
Yeah.
For sure.
All right, finally, the limerick. The murderer killed both Brenda and Babs. Strangled with neckties, no knifey stabs. When it comes to the tourists, he's not one for purists. There's no ripped whores, fog, or old handsome cabs.
Ooh, that's pretty good. I think you get a thumbs up on that limerick as well.
Well, I'll take that.
You can take three thumbs up.
Three out of 4?
Yeah. And
generous.
I reckon that, Hitchcock could have put any of those on a poster
Yeah.
to advertise this movie.
Yes. More movies should be advertised with limericks, I reckon.
Of course.
Yeah. So what did you think about the rewatch of Frenzy?
I think we both enjoyed it more on the rewatch, right? I really did not like this movie. So originally I think I had it down below 30 on my list, and I really hated it. But the rewatch, I enjoyed it a lot. I really enjoyed the rewatch. So I can see that sometimes you warm to these movies as you have them a second time around.
Yeah, I think I also enjoyed it more. I remember the first time around, I was very taken aback by the rape scene. I didn't quite expect it to be so brutal. And that turned me off, and it took me a while to win me back. I think I was eventually won back by the potato scene. But this time I kind of braced myself for the rape scene, and it seemed to be over a lot quicker this time around because I knew it was coming. So I could just enjoy the rest of it, which is really good. It also helped, I think, that I knew that I wasn't really ever going to like Richard because he was so self-absorbed.
Yes.
So I didn't have to worry about being interested in his life. I could just kind of enjoy the ride.
That's right. He doesn't care that his ex-wife and girlfriend have both been murdered at all.
No.
He comes back to chase Rusk because he doesn't want to, because he's been wrongly accused. That's his whole reasoning. He doesn't bother to avenge the deaths. I think the other reason we didn't like it on the first time around is very similar to that. Because of that rape scene, it's not just that it puts you off, it's that you think that there's going to be another 2 or 3.
Yeah.
And that's what makes you on edge for the rest of the movie the first time you watch it.
Yep.
And there actually isn't another one. And I think the fact that we knew that there wasn't another terrible rape scene coming meant that we could just relax as soon as it was over.
Yep.
So that, I think, is the key. I think that's absolutely the key. And that's why people shouldn't put those horrible scenes, except if it's a genuine horror, at the start of the movies, because I don't know that it made it more of a thriller the first time around. I actually think it made us enjoy it less.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right.
And I think when you're watching a genuine horror movie, it's great to have really terrible scenes at the start. Then you want to be horrified for the whole thing.
On edge,
yeah, you're expecting, but maybe not so much for this one. But I guess it depends what you enjoy about a movie. Some people might have looked forward to more terrible scenes, but I certainly didn't. I think the other thing I got out of the rewatch was that Rusk was trying to frame Richard from the start.
You reckon?
So I think, because remember when they met at the fruit market, he was dropping all these hints going, oh, your ex, have you seen your ex lately? Oh, you should go visit your ex. She's a lovely woman, right?
Yep.
So that was right at the very start, which does help frame him later. So he knows he's going to kill this woman.
Yes, right.
And he tries to get Richard in the vicinity. So I think that was great.
Yeah, you're right, because otherwise it was a little bit random that he just showed up at her business, right?
Yeah, and he remember he said, "No, I haven't seen her for ages." So he wasn't in the habit of just going and visiting her, but he popped that thought, he incepted that thought into his mind, which I thought was fantastic.
So, do we have any overrated scenes in this movie?
Well, we have. Let's go through the most famous scenes, right? So we have the potato truck scene.
Yep.
I don't think that's overrated.
Definitely not. That's one of the great Hitchcock scenes, I reckon.
Yeah.
I think that's a fantastic scene.
Yeah,
It won me over the first time around, and I loved it just as much the second time around. It's fantastic.
I think it's great. It's been replicated to some degree, but I still think it's pretty original. When you watch it, you don't go, oh, I've seen this scene millions of times in subsequent movies, which is sometimes what happens with a Hitchcock popular scene. The other two most sort of popular scenes or most talked about famous scenes, one is the rape and murder of Brenda, which is quite brutal, as we talked about.
Yep.
And again, I don't know that that's overrated. That was quite an unusual degree of nudity and horror of the era. So I don't think it's overrated. Do you think it's overrated?
No, it's No, it's certainly not pleasant. But
No.
It's not supposed to be pleasant.
No, that's right. And I think the other one that's famous in this movie is the long, silent camera pan out of Rusk's flat after he as he murders Babs, when we know there's a murder going on inevitably, and we don't see or hear anything until we get out into the street.
Yeah, no, that's a great shot as well.
Again, not overrated at all. That's a brilliant scene, and I think it deserves all of the mentions that it might get. So I'm not sure there's overrated. What about underrated? Did you have an underrated scene?
I do have an underrated scene. The scene that tickled me the first time, tickled me just as much the second time, is the scene where Brenda's secretary, I think her name is Monica, she gives this incredible description, this very detailed description about what Richard looks like. So the perfect eyewitness, and even Oxford comments on it, how just absolutely incredible she is.
Yeah, because she's basically caught a glimpse of him. Even Oxford is even surprised.
Yep.
I love that. That's almost breaking the fourth wall, how surprised he is about the description.
Yep.
That was really great.
Yes.
Now, as we watched this movie, we played Hitchcock Bingo. Tell us what's Hitchcock Bingo?
Well, Hitchcock Bingo, and it was pointed out to us that technically it was Bing because it was a 4x4 card rather than a 5x5 card.
Ah, right.
But we did have various items from our Hitchcock checklist, and also some frenzy specific things to keep an eye out. And as we watched the movie, people could check them off. And it was a little bit of a freewheeling affair because we did have a lot of these tropes and items on the bingo card
first
very
10
early,
minutes.
so people were just crossing off wildly. So it was a little bit difficult to tell who won. But the important
Because you
thing,
only have to win, one line, don't you, to win it
So
effectively?
but anyway, everyone had a good time. So that was the most important thing.
Yep.
And of course, if you'd like to join us on our next rewatch and play whatever the 19th best Hitchcock movie is, bingo, then you can just become a patron of HitchPod via patreon.com/HitchPod.
So we had some other interaction with various people who rewatched this movie, and
Before we get to the interaction, I'll just go through some of the stats on this particular ranking.
yes, okay, yep.
So of all the people who ranked it, the highest that anybody ranked this movie in their list, someone ranked it 6th out of their Hitchcock movies.
Okay, someone who'd seen 6 movies.
Maybe. The lowest ranking was 43rd.
Oh, wow. Was that me?
May have been. No, I'm not sure you voted. The percentage who had it in the top 20, 48% of people had it in their top 20, which probably explains why it was 20th.
Number 20, that's very
the percentage who had it in the top 10 was 13%. So, one in 8 people.
Any differences between the patrons and non-patrons here?
It was. The patron votes were the ones that pushed it into the top 20. So our patrons preferred this. Without the patrons, it would have come 25th. So the patrons got this onto the list. So there you go.
Thank you, patrons, for making us rewatch this. It was definitely a fun rewatch.
Yes. And we also did some Twitter polls to get our initial feedback on what people thought about this. So we ran maybe four Twitter polls. Favourite male character was Inspector Oxford.
Now, there's not much competition here because all of the male characters are just frightful. They're ghastly, aren't they?
Yep. So it was a thrashing. Inspector Oxford, 63%. Favourite female character was, kept it in the family, Mrs. Oxford. 56%. So
I think Hitchcock would be very delighted that it's two random
side characters basically.
That got this favourite. But, the female and the male characters are both quite uninspiring, which is incredible that the movie plays so well with such terrible characters in it.
Yep. We also asked, have you ever been trapped in a potato sack? And 50% of people preferred not to answer. And the final question that we asked, final poll question was, what was your preferred French cuisine? And the answer, French fries, 70%.
Right,
So
not frog's legs.
Not frog's legs, yes.
Okay, fantastic.
And we also have people getting back to us via email.
With questions?
With questions, and also telling us what their favourite scene was. I think
yes.
the potato truck scene was a common one. So
Everyone's favourite scene?
Hard to argue with, yes.
Yeah, okay, that's good.
But we did get some questions. So
well, let's go through the questions then.
Have you got a question?
Yep. So we had Bianca, who did this one come through on Twitter?
I think this was email.
Email, okay.
Yep.
She went on. She was the one who said that the potato truck was their favourite scene. And then she went on to ask about the period when Rich was on trial and briefly imprisoned. And she asks, did Rusk just stop killing women during that period? Because if he did, that would clear Richard immediately.
Yeah, so he must have stopped killing. So was the trial should have been longer. Would have kept the city safe if the judicial process was too swift, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Like it felt like it was just 5 minutes. But did Rusk know that Richard was out of jail when he killed that last woman?
I don't know, yeah.
I imagine that he was going to go on to have a different calling card. The
maybe.
necktie murderer is already in jail. This is the sock murderer or something.
Yeah, like a copycat killer.
Yeah, or the belt murderer.
The belt murderer.
Something different.
The suspenders murderer.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think neckties are easier though because, you do have more than one, whereas belts or, some of these other things, you'd be running out the rate that he was killing women.
Yep. Well, I mean, obviously, this is the major downside to framing somebody, right? That you've got to stop your serial killing.
Yep.
So, yeah, very, very bad mood. We also had a question from our patron who is presumably operating under an alias because this is Norman Bates asking this question. Hello, Norman. Norman's question was, how much do you think the movie being set in England and being played mostly by English actors helped its success?
I wonder about that. I feel like it would have been more successful if it was set in the US. What do you think?
Oh, I think the English setting and the spree it's very evocative of not just a Jack the Ripper thing, but also Hitchcock's earlier movies as well. I mean, those two characters that are kind of alluded to in the limerick were actually remarking about how it was basically what people expected when they come to London. The occasional spate of murders and serial killing. Yeah,
so they did have a few sort of landmarks of London, not too many.
No.
But certainly if you watch this movie and believed it, it wouldn't make you inclined to have a holiday there, right?
No, that's true.
It didn't really paint London in the best possible light.
No, I'm not sure anywhere in the 70s was painted in the best possible light.
No.
Everything looked a little bit brown and grey and miserable.
Yeah. That's what the 70s were like, right?
As I recall.
Anyway, we got one more question. This is from Anne. Why did we see Rusk's mother at the start?
This is an excellent question.
Yeah.
I think we actually mused about this on our first coverage of this as well. We had this random mother. I remember when I first watched it, I thought for sure she was the dead body
at the end.
At the end, I thought that's perfect. That ties everything together.
Yep.
But no, it wasn't. That was just a random woman that...
Yeah, that was the final scene where Richard was clubbing somebody to death, presumably.
Yeah, and I thought it was just going to be Rusk's mother having a nap and then Richard comes in and accidentally kills her. I thought that's that's a very dark but fitting ending to the movie.
Interesting ending.
Yeah. But otherwise, I don't know.
No.
Well, the mother doesn't. Going from Psycho, is this an allusion to Psycho? Is there no mother? Is this Rusk dressed up as his mother? Spoiler for Psycho.
Could be.
Yes.
We don't really have a good reason for that because you would think you would, unless it was absolutely essential, you would cut that scene out.
Yeah.
It may have been in the book. We couldn't find the book, right?
No, we are. One of the things we're going to do this season is, where possible, we're going to have a bit of a book club on our Patreon. So again, patreon.com/HitchPod. But we tried to track. We knew there was a book out there this was made of, but it is long out of print and impossible to find copies. So apologies for missing out on the book club for this one. Probably didn't miss much.
All right, so that's it for questions. Let's revisit our rankings from the first time around. So I originally had this movie at 40. And, I did like it much more on the rewatch.
Yeah.
I reckon it might elevate up my original list. I haven't actually redone that.
Yeah, but you think it would go higher, for
I
sure.
think it would go higher than 40.
Yeah.
I really would.
So you think it's a top half Hitchcock movie now or still somewhere in the middle?
I think
middle's roughly 25, 26.
I think I would put it around the middle for me.
Yeah. I had it 17th originally, and I think I'm pretty happy with that. I think 17th is pretty much where our listeners have ranked it as well. Not too far different, so I'm happy with that. So
I think it probably is a good idea for me to re-rank my movies. I would like to have a current list, so maybe I will rejig them and put it at about 25.
Okay, all right.
Now we're going to do a deep dive into one scene, one particular scene.
Yes,
and I believe you have some audio.
We've got the audio.
Woman's intuition is worth more than all those laboratories. I can't think why you don't teach it in police colleges.
So you think it's Rusk, do you? You think he's our man?
Well, of course. Anyone can see that. He knew both Mrs. Blaney and that Barbara what's-her-name, didn't he?
Yeah.
Well, there you are. You told me the man's a sexual pervert. That's why he kept the clothes and put them in poor Mr. Blaney's case.
We have no proof of that.
It stands to reason.
Don't you mean intuition? What does your intuition tell you I want for dinner tonight?
Steak and a baked potato. But you're getting pied de porc à la mode de coin.
It looks like a pig's foot.
That's what it is. I've put it in the same sauce the French use for tripe.
Well, that's comforting.
Well, When are you going to arrest this Mr. Robinson or Rusk or whatever he's called?
When I have the proof I need. Takes a little longer to acquire than intuitive insights.
So there are actually two scenes with Inspector Oxford eating the dreadful French cuisine that his wife has cooked for him. This is the second one of those, or a segment of it. So obviously this scene serves a couple of purposes, or both of these Inspector Oxford eating the bad food scenes serve a couple of purposes. Firstly, they kind of allow a whole heap of exposition to be dropped into the film, so that's always very handy.
Yep.
And the wife asks questions about the hunt for the necktie murder, and he can let the audience into what the police are thinking.
Far more interesting than just the police talking to each other.
Yes, definitely. Especially when you consider the second element of this, which is an opportunity to add some comedy in what is an otherwise not particularly amusing Hitchcock movie. So there's not many other comic elements in this particular one.
Puts a real ring around the comedy, doesn't it? It means that it's completely separate really to it's one step removed from the murders.
Yep.
Hitchcock loved food so much that he would have adored putting in a scene about food, and there's other food-related scenes throughout Hitchcock movies as well. In this one, not only is this a food-related theme running through the movie, there were other names. Remember the other names that are food-related? So we have Rusk, we have Miss Barley, who was the secretary, we have the old RAF buddy who was Neville Salt. So we have quite a lot of food themes running through, as well as it being a fruit market. They were eating grapes, they were eating apples. Like, there's a lot of food in this movie, isn't it?
Yeah, and Hitchcock's really doing something very interesting with the comedy in this scene, and I am fully aware that analysing comedy does tend to kill it, but I do want to have like a closer look at how these two scenes work comedy-wise, because there are multiple levels of comedy kind of at work in these scenes. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the multiple levels of comedy at work beyond the fruit names. So we first of all we have this contrast between Oxford's search for the evidence that will prove Rusk is the murderer and the wife's female intuition that Rusk is the murderer, and that's a pretty classic stereotype of a women's intuition joke. And it's goes along standard lines. She intuits the truth, and the husband, this very logical, an actual detective, has to do the more rational logic, and of course is behind. He doesn't work it out until later. So it's a reliable joke. It's not particularly innovative.
No,
but it's kind of always fun to undercut the character who has seemingly higher status. In this case, the professional detective.
That's right, and he's uncertain and waiting for evidence, whereas she's absolutely certain. There's no question. Move on. Have some more soup.
Yes. And then you've got the second level of the joke, which, as we mentioned, is the awful food that she's cooking. And again, this is kind of a tried and true stereotype. The wife is an awful cook. That's an old joke, but it's an old movie as well. So.
Yeah, and it was an old joke that would have been sprinkled throughout the 50s and 60s as well, which means that Hitchcock had to change it up a bit.
So basically the humour of this comes from, Oxford just wants a simple meal. His wife is determined to give him all these fancy meals, and so that's kind of an amusing premise on its own, and then it kind of gets accentuated by the fact that the fancy meals are awful and he hates them. And that kind of also adds a little bit of a visual comedy element, because whenever she turns her back to go back to the kitchen, he's always trying to return food to the serving bowls or otherwise get rid of it without having to eat it.
He's very kind, isn't he?
He
never at any stage, and I think that adds to the humour as well, he never at any stage makes any sort of comments that really hurt her feelings. He does occasionally let her know that he's a little bit uncomfortable with it all. I also like the other visual bit of humour that was here, which was Mrs. Oxford snapping the breadsticks as he's talking about the fingers snapping as well. That was amazing. That was really great.
And Hitchcock has also tied these kind of two old-fashioned jokes together, as you mentioned, kind of giving an extra element to them, because the awful food ties back to the intuition joke, because the wife correctly intuits that he wants a more normal dinner. She specifically says, I intuit that you want that, but that's not what she's going to give him. So tying the two tired joke formats together elevates both of them. So she doesn't care that she's a bad cook. She's just going to be doing it anyway. But beyond all that, the thing that truly elevates these two scenes is a very sophisticated joke format. So in comedy, you've got this very traditional approach where the traditional approach is you do a setup, punchline, punchline. So there's nothing particularly innovative about that.
What's the punchline so far? We had a punchline in this joke?
No. This is the clever bit. So usually you kind of establish a path that you want your viewer to go down, and then subvert their expectations with something unexpected, and that's
and you either do that in
funny.
the same scene, or you might wait a couple of scenes and then do it. Yeah.
You could that would ideally be how you'd be doing it. But the higher level joke at work that Hitchcock does it the exact reverse order. He gives the punchline first and then does the setup, because before either of these scenes take place, we see Inspector Oxford having breakfast, and he's just wolfing down this giant plate of bacon and eggs. And there's no explanation at the time for why he's having such an enormous meal, and no explanation for why he's devouring it. It's only later when we see his wife's cooking that we realise why he's so incredibly hungry.
Yeah, and it is kind of, it's not completely unusual to see a policeman eating something unhealthy. That's another fairly normal stereotype. But it is a bit odd in the movie, because he's discussing the evidence with his subordinates while he's eating this meal, and you kind of go, there's something wrong about that.
And so if it had been done the more normal way, if we'd seen the wife, doing the terrible cooking, and then later seen him wolfing down this meal, that's the standard setup punchline. We've set up that he doesn't get to eat enough at home. Punchline is, he's got to eat all this, this gigantic breakfast later, and that would be perfectly fine. That would be a fine joke in itself. I mean, especially if Hitchcock didn't draw any attention to it, which he probably wouldn't have. He would have just let the viewer work it out. But this is even better. This is an incredibly sophisticated joke, because he's given you the food first, and then he's given you the setup for it, and so you get to work it out. And that's a really tough joke format to pull off. But when it works, and it does work here, because I remember it especially works on a rewatch. You know exactly why he's so hungry the first time. But even the first time we watched it, I remember noticing this and thinking, I get that. And it makes the audience feel clever for having spotted the connection.
Right. Yes.
And so it's it might fly over the heads of some viewers, but for those who get it will just really appreciate it. And I think it's very clever of Hitchcock to have, jokes that work on multiple levels of viewer sophistication. So you've got this one that rewards the very clever and observant people, and you've got, perhaps not quite
some
as sophisticated ones.
The breadstick.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think this is really great. This is the reason why Inspector Oxford was the most popular character, because it means we really sympathise with him too, particularly later on when they're at the truck stop and he says, sort of wistfully, and they serve very basic food like bacon and egg sandwiches, and it's like you feel kind of sorry for him because he's probably always hungry. It really means we do sympathise and empathise with him. I also love the fact that the other thing about Mrs. Oxford that's so delightful is she never eats this dreadful food. She knows full well how dreadful it is. She doesn't look food deprived.
No.
So I think presumably she's also eating bacon and eggs for breakfast. So I really love that. Yes. And I also, the other thing I love about this as a joke, and it's absolutely brilliant that you've analysed it. So this is my favourite segment, not just my favourite part of this movie. This is my favourite segment of this podcast. But I also really hope that those exact foods that were mentioned in these terrible scenes were meals that Hitch had to endure.
Oh, that would be perfect.
And the people watching the movie probably served these things up to him at different times. The directors he hated, the pig's feet, the fish head soup. I really hope that his less satisfying dinner parties, because Alma never served up that kind of food. She served up kind of fancy French but very hearty fare, right? So he was having a dig at whoever gave him terrible food as well.
Write a screenplay, cast your star, shoot a picture, but look out, the wicked censor will try to stop you and ruin everything. Play the secret Hitchcock card game in one continuous take at your next dinner party. Secret Hitchcock. Don't forget the cameo. But before we get to the Hitchcock do-over, I just want to wish a happy birthday to number 17, which turns 90 this month.
Number 17 being a Hitchcock movie, of course.
All right, so this segment, we're going to talk about... we know Hitchcock liked to redo ideas from his own movies. He had 39 Steps. A lot of those ideas were reworked into North by Northwest.
Yep.
We had a couple of Men Who Knew Too Much and so forth. So we're just kind of wondering, Hitchcock with an additional 30 years of experience, which would have made him, 102 for this particular one?
Yep.
What would he have changed for this particular movie?
What would he do differently? He may well have set this in the US or somewhere different. I think this movie would have worked really well. I mean, it worked well in England, we were talking about, but why not set it in France and have the cook trying to cook traditional American food or something like that. That would be quite good as well.
Yep.
But I think we agree that that probably that rape scene may be differently shot these days.
Yeah, I think so. I think it was pretty much a product of the era.
Yeah.
I was doing a little bit of research. You had something like Peeping Tom, which we have covered on our Patreon feed. That came out like a decade earlier than this, but around about this time, you had Hollywood movies that were really starting to push the boundaries.
Well, this was the first movie that came out after the production code disappeared. This is the first movie where there were ratings instead of production code over everyone's shoulder. So everyone was breaking all the rules that they were not allowed to break previously whenever that ended.
Yeah, so you had things like Bonnie and Clyde in 1968 had one of the bloodiest death scenes ever. You had Midnight Cowboy, which had an X rating and was still a success. And still, around this era, a little bit later, was Chinatown and Taxi Driver. Yeah. So Frenzy feels very much of that era.
That's right. People who went to see movies were happy to go see R-rated and X-rated movies because that was a bit of a novelty.
Yeah, and this was Hitchcock's only R-rated movie. So but basically, people kind of were excited to see all these taboos being broken. I think, but once they have been broken, you really don't need to see it again. It's like, all right, we can't. Okay, we've explored that. That's interesting, but only once maybe. So, and I think even Hitchcock kind of acknowledged that more or less in the film, because the second murder and presumably rape of Babs we don't see, and that I think it's far more effective for it.
Yeah, it left that completely to our imagination. So that's true. So probably in a remake today, that would be what Hitch would do.
I think so. Yeah, I think there'd be just be a little bit less confrontational about it, maybe.
Yeah. So another thing we're going to look at is who would Hitch cast if he was doing this movie again? Yeah,
so I think if he was doing it in today's times, I can really see, I've got a couple here. I can see Jason Bateman of Arrested Development, Ozark and Teen Wolf 2. I think he'd be great in the Inspector Oxford role with those dry, sarcastic kind of under the breath asides about the food. I think he could really nail that.
So make that really snarky, deadpan and kind of reluctant. Yeah, that is a very good call.
And I'd also like to see somebody like in the Rusk role. I'd like to see somebody like Adam Driver, Kylo Ren himself.
Ooh,
so this big murderous, this big guy I think he'd give a good murderous intensity to the role. He's a big guy, handsome and charming, but
is he
this
charming?
I think he could be pretty charming. Maybe. I don't know.
I think it needs to be someone old.
Older, you reckon?
Yeah, I think old. So I'm thinking old, still thinks he's a bit of a silver fox, but not really. So kind of attractive, but teeth slightly too white.
Right.
So you know who I'm thinking of here?
Oh, no idea.
I'm thinking of Tom Cruise.
Tom Cruise.
As Rusk.
Tom Cruise as Rusk. Oh, okay, yeah.
We're not really picking English actors here, but they can do English accents.
Exactly,
yeah.
Yes. What about if we wanted to do a sequel to this movie? How could we add a sequel to this particular
There's
one?
lots of possibilities here, and we know that there would be these serial killers always have a copycat, right? So in every sequel, in Frenzy 2, there would be a copycat murderer, and presumably we don't know if Hitch is making these sequels. It's presumably someone different.
Well, so Hitch didn't make any of the Psycho sequels, so let's assume he's not making any of these.
So this is just another tired trope of the repeat necktie murderer popping up, inspired by the original. But we could have some of the same characters from the original.
Yeah, I think Inspector Oxford has to be called back into action to investigate this as well.
Yeah,
I think he'd go check on Rusk, who's still in prison, and he maybe check on Richard.
And that's the advantage of this later era where we didn't hang all of our murderers. Yes. They just went to prison for life, which meant that they could appear in the sequels.
Yeah, I think the new necktie murderer could be like the owner of the pub trying to frame Richard again. I like the idea of Richard being framed again for it. Yeah.
Just 4 or 5 years later.
Yeah.
New girlfriend, turned it over a new leaf.
Yeah.
He's stopped drinking.
Yep. But he's going to be framed because I think the owner of the pub would still blame him for Babs's death because he was pretty cavalier about just letting her go around. So yeah.
That's right.
I have a very strong vision of the final scene in the Oxford's house. I think Inspector Oxford has to rush back home because he deduces who the real murderer is, and he's racing there. But the new necktie murderer is already dead because he's choked to death on one of Mrs. Oxford's concoctions.
Oh, and then all of the suspense is about will he have murdered Mrs. Oxford? But no, it's the other way around.
He had a meal, he died, and like the final shock would be him trying to remove his own tie to breathe, but he choked to death before he could.
Oh, that is an excellent final scene. Absolutely. Do you know there was originally a final scene in Frenzy 1?
No, not.
They filmed it as well, I think, but the final scene was Richard going around for dinner with Mr. and Mrs. Oxford. Yes, that was
fantastic.
a final scene, and Hitchcock wanted. I'm pretty sure they filmed it, and the final meal was some kind of duck meal and a margarita, and the final camera was close up of the duck.
It was like his beak still on, presumably.
Yeah, maybe. So that you're on the same wavelength here as Hitchcock, as we know you are. What about a prequel? A prequel would be a great idea because there's a fair bit of history here with these guys. They were fairly old. They'd had a history in, I don't know, the Vietnam War or the Korean War or some war.
Yeah, I would love to see a kind of rom-com prequel with with Richard and his RAF buddy and his buddy's girlfriend or
Hetty.
wife, Hetty.
Hetty, yeah.
Hetty, who just despised him, and I'd love to see why we could learn why she's so contemptuous of him, apart from the obvious thing of his personality.
He's being a loser.
Yeah. So I think it's this classic love triangle. I think he's hitting on Hetty the whole time.
Yeah.
But his best buddy doesn't realise it, and she has to do all the work to keep rejecting him. And his mate's still saying, "Oh, I love Richard. He's a great guy." And so a bit of comedy there, I think.
Hetty definitely needs her own show. She was great. How was she? She was wearing that weird outfit. She said, "I'm going shopping." She was fantastic.
Yeah.
What about a TV show? Who would you give a TV show to?
I think in terms of minor characters getting a spin-off, I think the secretary, Brenda's secretary, Monica, could get a show called Murder She Witnessed. And she gets a new job each episode, witnesses the aftermath of a murder and uses her incredible powers of observation to investigate and solve it.
Oh, wow. I mean, it could be also one of those British shows where in an incredibly small town and nearly everyone gets murdered. So maybe the murder victims are always victims of the dating agency.
Yep.
Because it felt like she went on to run that dating agency.
Well, let's assume she did.
Yeah.
Yep. All right, what to watch next? So we tracked down this great site called bestsimilar.com, and you can plug in a movie and it'll tell you other movies that are very similar. So this is, if you enjoyed Frenzy, you'll probably also like the following. So we've got Wait Until Dark from 1967. This one stars Audrey Hepburn. A recently blinded woman is terrorised by a trio of thugs while they search for a heroin stuffed doll they believe is in her apartment.
Oh, I think I've seen that movie.
Have you?
Yeah.
There you go, Wait Until Dark, 1967. We also had Tightrope from 1984. That stars Clint Eastwood. New Orleans single dad and cop Wes Block goes after a serial rapist killer, but when he gets too close, the hunter suddenly becomes, and you'll never guess this, the hunted.
Wowee.
Straight On Till Morning, 1972. A timid, withdrawn woman meets a man she believes is finally the love of her life, unaware that he is a vicious serial killer.
That doesn't sound like it has too many redeeming features, but anyway.
They do sound very similar, though.
They do.
Jennifer 8, starring Andy Garcia and Uma Thurman. This is from 1992.
That sounds familiar.
A former Los Angeles homicide detective investigates a multiple murder case in San Diego, and the only witness is a blind girl to whom he is immediately attracted.
Former homicide detective.
Yep. And finally, we've got See No Evil from 1971, starring Mia Farrow. A young blind woman is pursued by a maniac while staying with family in their country manor. There's so many blind women in these.
Why are they all blind?
I don't know. Should there have been a blind woman in Frenzy? It sounds
maybe
like
there was.
probably
Maybe we missed her.
Well, it certainly wasn't the secretary, right?
No, she was definitely cited. Could have been Mrs. Oxford.
Yes. So if you enjoyed Frenzy, check out any one of those movies, and maybe you'll enjoy them. Or alternatively, you could watch our next movie, which is going to be what?
Well, we are going to watch the best movie that came out in the same year. So in 1972, according to the Oscars at least, the best movie was The Godfather.
Yes. So that's what we will be covering next month.
Slightly famous.
Slightly famous. You may have heard of it. We'll be doing a face-off between The Godfather and Frenzy. So we'll go through all the major categories: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, etc. And we'll see if Hitch was robbed. Robbed by some kind of mafia hoodlum, no doubt.
He was always robbed when it came to the Oscars. So we're going to enjoy that.
Yes. But until then, I'm Dan Lipke, heading off to eat a giant breakfast.
Are you?
Yep.
And I'm Kat Jones, and I'm off to search for a lost tie pin. Thank you for listening to HitchPod. Please come and talk to us on Twitter at HitchPod Tweets or on Facebook by searching for HitchPod And you can also email us directly at feedback@hitchpodonline.com. And if you want more Hitchcock content, please consider becoming a HitchPod supporter. Just go to patreon.com/HitchPod, and for as little as $2 a month, you can get access to our Season 1 coverage of every single Hitchcock movie, as well as bonus episodes on Hitchcock-esque movies. Invitations also to watch live rewatches and much, much more.
Miss Barling, could you describe Mr. Blaney for us? What he looked like, what he was wearing, and so on?
Well, yes, I think I can. He was a man in his 30s, about an inch or so under 6 foot tall. He had dark hair, green eyes, and a moustache. I estimate his weight at about 155 pounds.
He was wearing a rather old-fashioned jacket with leather patches on the shoulders and at the elbows. In my opinion, it was quite unsuitable for London. He was also carrying a raincoat.
That's an extraordinarily precise description, Miss Barling.